Is your podcast intro killing your podcast? Your intro makes or breaks the episode. This is where your listener decides, is this worth my time? Heck, you're deciding that right now. If you're losing a lot of your listeners or viewers in the first couple of minutes of an episode, you need to fix your intro. And I'm going to help you do that. I'm Jen Eads, the head broad in charge at the Brassy Broadcasting Company, where I've been podcasting since 2014. In this episode of the Basic Broadcast Series, you are going to learn the 5 key ingredients to write an irresistible intro that hooks your audience. And then I'll give you a practice so you can start writing your own irresistible podcast intros. As always, I'm going to tell you, this isn't the only way to do it, but it's a great place to start if you're new to podcasting or if you need to spice up your episode intros. Now, it's still pretty common to hear one of those canned podcast intros. You know, the royalty-free music kicks in. Or something like that. And then you get the big, boomy radio voice telling you all about the host and what to expect in this podcast and why it's so fabulous and it is the podcast for you. This was all the rage when I started podcasting back in 2014. Now it's kind of like the shag carpet of podcasting. It's a little dated. Podcast listeners are more savvy these days, and there's a lot more choice. You've got to hook their attention by making it all about them and what they're going to get out of this episode. So let's get into the 5 ingredients that you need in your podcast intro. Now, keep in mind that this intro that I'm writing for is geared toward podcast where you're trying to educate your listeners or trying to create some change or transformation in their lives. So different podcasts need different types of intros. The first ingredient is the pattern interrupt. This is where you're going to ask a big question, make a bold statement, maybe it's even a little controversial, or you're going to share some surprising statistic that is relevant to the change that your audience wants to make or the topic that they want to learn about. For example, at the beginning of this episode, I asked the question, is your podcast intro killing your podcast? The second ingredient is a pain point, and it needs to be specific, which I realize sounds a little counterintuitive. But being specific is really what makes it universal, and that's what's going to resonate most deeply with your listener. For example, the pain point I used in my episode intro is, are you losing a lot of listeners in the first couple minutes of your podcast? As a listener, when I'm listening to a podcast episode and I feel like the host has called me out a little bit, it gets my attention, and I want to stick around and hear what they have to say. The third ingredient is stakes and consequences. Stakes and consequences build tension and create a sense of urgency. Doesn't it sound weird to you that we are more likely to take action to prevent losing something rather than taking action so we could gain something? Humans are funny. The stakes or consequences I used in this episode intro was, the intro is where your listener decides, is this worth my time? Are you losing listeners? You don't want to lose listeners. That's what's at stake here. Those are the consequences of having a lame intro. Did that create a sense of urgency for you? Are you feeling like, wow, I need to pay attention to my intros. I don't want to lose any listeners. The fourth ingredient is credibility. Why should somebody listen to you? And it doesn't have to be a really long list of all of your credentials and all of your experiences. For example, I said, I'm Jen Eads, the head broad in charge at the Brassy Broadcasting Company, podcasting since 2014. Okay, I've been doing this over 10 years. I've got some experience. Maybe I know some things and you should listen to me. And finally, the fifth ingredient is the promise of transformation or some type of change. You will be changed or transformed in some way after listening to this episode. This is where you instill hope in your listener and create some curiosity about the solution to their problem that they're having, or what's that path to change look like? The change or transformation that I mentioned in this episode intro was that you're going to be able to write a better podcast intro after listening to this episode. Now you know the ingredients, so let's blend them all together. And you might feel a little overwhelmed if you're new to this, and that's totally okay. The key is to take what I'm teaching you and put it into practice, because podcasting is a continuous practice because it's always changing. Now for the challenge. Since I work with a lot of estate planning attorneys, can I take these 5 ingredients and put them together to create an episode intro aimed at Gen Xers, maybe some boomers who need to get their parents to write a will, or maybe they need to write their own? Have you written your will? Do you have an estate plan? I've written it in a way so that they don't feel shame or guilt around it. They just need that sense of urgency to get it done. So let's enter the land of make-believe and pretend that I'm an attorney. Prince died without a will or an estate plan in 2016. Not because he couldn't afford it. The guy had millions. We'll never know why he didn't get around to writing a will or an estate plan for what he wanted done with his legacy of music sitting in a vault. But maybe his reasons might hit a little closer to home than you would think. Like many of us, maybe Prince just put it off. I mean, the guy who said life is just a party and parties weren't meant to last. He knew it was going to come to an end at some point, and yet he still didn't get it done. Why did a man with millions of dollars and access to plenty of attorneys not get a will written? Maybe it's because he was super private. Maybe he didn't like lawyers. Or maybe he just thought that he had more time. Do any of these reasons sound familiar? I hear these same reasons every day from people just like you. They know they need a will. They just haven't taken the time to get it done. And here we are, almost 9 years later, and Prince's family is still battling it out in court. And his unreleased music, the legacy of his life's work, no plan. All because he put the planning conversation off or just didn't want to have it. Now, for most of us, it's not about what we're going to do with our vast millions or our musical legacy. Regardless of how big or small your estate is, do you want to leave it up to the state or the courts to decide what to do with your stuff and how that's going to impact your family? The state and the courts, they don't care about your family or your wishes. Do you really want to leave it up to them? I'm Jen, a pretend estate planning attorney licensed in the state of bliss. I work with families to help them avoid this exact situation, and here's what I've learned over the years. It's not about how much money you have. It's about protecting the people that you love. Don't let time run out before you get this done. In this episode, I'm going to map out the exact estate planning process that we use so that you don't feel overwhelmed. And I'm going to tell you what to expect at each stage of the process. This is going to make it easier for you to start having these conversations with your family. So when the party's over and your time runs out, they aren't sitting around asking, what are we supposed to do now? Why did mom make this so hard for us? And if you use a disclaimer in your episodes, like a lot of my attorneys have disclaimers that it's not legal advice, this is a great spot to put that disclaimer in, right before you get into the meat of the episode. That was my intro for an estate planning episode. What do you think? Let me know in the comments, or you can DM me. I'm hanging out on Instagram at BrassyBroadJen. Would you give it a listen if you hadn't written your will yet or needed an estate plan? What happens next after you've thought about these 5 ingredients? You write it down. You literally script it out. Oh, but Jen, I don't want it to kill my vibe. And, I just kind of go with the flow in my intro. No, your intro needs to be clear, concise, to the point, and tell your listener exactly what they can expect if they give you their time and attention. All right, you know what to do now. Here's your practice for the week. Get out a blank piece of paper or open up whatever device you write on and put your big idea, like the theme or the topic, at the top of your sheet. On the left-hand side of your paper, you're going to write pattern interrupt will be the first thing. And then you're going to leave a little space. And then you're going to put pain points. And then you're going to follow that with stakes/consequences. Number 4 is going to be credibility. And then last but not least, coming in at number 5 is the transformation or change that you are promising your listener in this episode. You write it down. You literally script it out. Put this into practice for all of your episodes moving forward now. And then give it 3 or 4 episodes and then go back and look at your retention analytics in Spotify, Apple Podcasts. If you're putting it on YouTube, look at your YouTube retention rates and see if your retention rate is starting to rise once you've put this into practice. If you don't know how to access those analytics in your Spotify dashboard, in Apple Podcast, or on YouTube, make sure you're subscribed to my Brassy Broad Gen YouTube channel because I will have some videos coming soon to show you exactly where and how to find those analytics. You can't fix it if you can't see it. Make sure you're checking your analytics regularly to see how your individual episodes are doing and how long your listeners are staying engaged. Thanks for tuning in. Now get out in the world and do some good.